You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
And it sure feels like deja vu today. We're sitting in Washington, D.C. around 2 o'clock in the afternoon waiting for something to happen at the federal court involving Donald Trump.
Yes.
But I guess that'll kind of be the next year for us.
Or even beyond, depending on how much his defense can delay the proceedings.
Yes. So it's all about the protective order.
Yes.
Today. Remember that thing he posted on Truth Social on Friday? Was that the whole point of this? Is that all, or is it just a composite of everything he has said publicly about his legal actions?
Perhaps the idea that this
really
is a former president who is very vocal, very present on social media, like Truth Social
I don't
specifically.
Think he slept over the weekend.
Yeah, it's like every 20 minutes, a new truth.
The big one, if you go after me, I'm coming after you. All caps. Very simple. And with punctuation, by the way. But it's not just what he's writing, it's what he's saying, right? I mean, this was South Carolina just a little more than 24 hours ago. Now imagine, Jack Smith, the special counsel, he's talking about the case and the prosecutor here.
We call it a sham indictment, and the man that's doing it, I really believe he's mentally ill. But these are outrageous, and it is an outrageous criminalization of political speech.
I'll just stop it right there. A sham indictment. Mm-hmm. Now, he's been doing this, he's, insulting the special counsel. First time we've heard that he had mental illness.
Well, he keeps calling him deranged Jack Smith, so maybe he sees those as synonymous.
Right. And he's implying also always that he changed his name from something. I really would like to know what he thinks that is. And then the full Ginsburg by the lawyers on Sunday morning, that's different. The lawyers can say what they're going to say. They're not going to talk about evidence in the way that he does. And so we'll find out, 3 hours from now, maybe beforehand. They have until 5 p.m. Washington time to respond.
Yeah, and I guess we'll see if they meet that deadline because, as you said, Mr. Lauro on the Sunday shows didn't seem inclined to suggest that they were going to go along with this protective order. And to come back to what the former president's saying, it kind of comes back to the case they're making about this indictment here in Washington broadly, that this is about free speech.
The First Amendment case, yes. Yeah. And then we've got Fulton County.
Right.
That could truly be any day. All we got from the prosecutor there was before the 1st of September.
Yes.
But we know they're working something up, and there's frankly a lot of talk that it could be imminent. I'll put it to you this way. Bloomberg legal reporter Erik Larson is joining us from Georgia right now. Erik, I hope you're getting something good to eat. It's great to have you back. When's this thing going to drop?
Thank you. Well, we, of course, were prepared for it to come as soon as this morning. There had been some rumblings in the local press here that might be in the works, based on some big security measures that the Fulton County courthouse had taken starting today. And also just the timeline of these two grand juries that sort of meet regularly during this week. So nothing has happened, obviously, but I did go down to the courthouse, saw that there was a lot of police presence, Fulton County Sheriff's vehicles blocking the road in front of the courthouse, lots of barricades set up all around on the streets. Lots of TV vans, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a familiar thing that we've seen before, first in Manhattan and then in Florida and then again in Washington and now here.
It's like deja vu all over again, Erik. We just seem to be constantly in braced mode waiting for another indictment to drop. Though I think we expect this to be the last one, at least that we're aware of for the time being, number 4, and that would be it, right?
Yeah, correct. That's our count, but you never know what could happen in the future. We do know that there are there's still a grand jury in D.C. We know that in the classified documents case in Florida, the government, of course, the Jack Smith, there was a superseding indictment in that case that added some more claims. So, you never know what could happen. But yes, we're expecting this to be the 4th and final indictment.
Well, and you referenced what happened here in Washington just last week. Yes, it was literally just days ago that the former president was arraigned once again. But both of these cases in Washington and then in Fulton County involve trying to interfere with the 2020 election and the transition of power. How is the Georgia case specifically different as a state case versus the federal one? How are they likely to diverge potentially?
Well, they're going to be prosecuting, if this does come, they'll be prosecuting a very similar but different set of, state laws, state election laws. And, experts have said that, every state has some sort of election fraud law, and Georgia is going to potentially claim that Trump's efforts to persuade Georgia elected officials to overturn the election, and also efforts by his allies to convince state lawmakers that there had been fraud by giving information that potentially just wasn't true. And of course, the fake electors, or as they call them, the alternate slates of electors. We saw in the DC case how that was used to allege fraud against the United States, and Georgia could do something similar here. They had a similar slate of electors here, and we know that a lot of them have been involved in this investigation. So if we're going to see some very similar, I would think, if there is an indictment here, I think it would overlap a lot in its language and allegations with what we saw in DC, which was just alleging a completely illegal and improper attempt to overturn the votes of millions of people who had voted for Joe Biden and not for Trump.
Wow. Erik, just to get back to the matter at hand today here in Washington, this protective order, what different paths could this take? Obviously, the Trump team wanted a delay that was rejected over the weekend. If they reject this or push back on this today, then what next? How does that work procedurally?
Well, I mean, it's really depends on how aggressive I think the judge would want to be, and in terms of how hard Trump's legal team would press for appeals. Say the protective order is issued, they might try to appeal that, and they'll probably try to appeal a lot of things as this case progresses. As you were saying earlier, there's some delay issues involved here, delay tactics, one could say. So Trump doesn't seem to be helping himself with all these truths. Saying that outright, one of the things he said on social media over the weekend was that he wanted a federal takeover of Washington, and he knew that would not be very popular with potential jurors. So it's almost like he's begging the judge to, consider him to be a threat to the jury pool, which is very strange, but also very Trump. So I'm very curious to see what the judge will say on this, if she'll just kind of brush it off and be like, no, sorry, or if she's going to, give his arguments a day in court. Honestly, could go either way.
All right, Erik, thanks for coming back. Are you there till this happens? Or maybe we shouldn't talk about that on the air.
Oh, that's a good question.
You'd like to know, too. Erik Larson, Bloomberg legal reporter. We'll find you wherever you are. He does such a great job leading our coverage on this, Kaylee. And we want to add the voice of Jimmy Gurulé, law professor at Notre Dame and former assistant U.S. attorney in the Central District of California. Jimmy, it's great to have you here. What happens with this protective order? What should happen is a better way to ask it.
Well, I think first of all, we need to make sure that the listeners understand the purpose of the protective order.
Yes.
And so the special counsel is seeking a protective order that would prevent President Trump from disclosing on Truth Social, his social media platform, evidence in the case. For example, witness statements, maybe transcripts of witnesses that testified before the grand jury in the case, and the disclosure of which could have a chilling effect, maybe an intimidating effect on those particular witnesses and other witnesses as well. And so, again, the prosecutor is requesting that Trump be directed and prohibited from disclosing that type of evidence and information on a public platform.
Just to be clear, though, and just so our listeners understand, this would go for not just Truth Social, but any form of public speech, right? Correct. Including the stump. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And so the harm would be the same regardless of which platform or which media device or mechanism was used to disclose it. And so again, there's this concern about evidence that's going to be presented at trial being presented to the public, and then that having a deterrent, chilling effect on witnesses that may be testifying in the case.
Well, Jimmy, if you listen to the former president, he says a protective order would infringe on his free speech. And his attorneys over the weekend on all the Sunday shows were talking about free speech, First Amendment rights as being a key issue here. I mean, John Lauro on CNN, I believe, Joe, was talking about how the requests that Trump was making weren't actually requests, they were asks.
The aspirational ask.
And asking is aspirational.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's not what's alleged in the indictment, of course. And,
so you don't think this kind of First Amendment argument would be one that's ultimately going to hold up?
Yeah, we need to make an important distinction between protected free speech and conduct. And so certainly former President Trump or anyone has a protected constitutional right to make statements, even if the statements are false and even if the statements are knowingly false when they're made. But it's different when you say, for example, I believe that the election was stolen. If he wants to state that, if former President Trump wants to state that, which of course he has repeatedly, that's protected. But then if he goes the next step and says, and because the election was stolen, I want you to join me in a conspiracy to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, to prevent the actual counting and certification of the electoral votes at the congressional proceedings on January 6th. That's different. That conduct, that concerted action, that's not protected free speech under the First Amendment.
Well, so that aspirational ask was a big moment on the Sunday shows yesterday as John Lauro did the full Ginsburg. I'm curious your thought on another important moment in the conversation here, Jimmy, and that's relocating the trial. That's the seeking a new venue, and he believes that West Virginia would be the place to go. Here's what he said.
Absolutely. We would like a diverse venue, a diverse jury.
Do you have any expectation that will be granted?
That reflects the characteristics of the American people. It's up to the judge. I think West Virginia would be an excellent venue to try this case.
That was from Face the Nation on CBS. Jimmy, is this the comedy portion of the program?
That's humorous. That's actually humorous because if you look at the population makeup in West Virginia, I believe it's something over 90% of the population is white.
Yeah. I think 93%, yeah.
And in Washington, D.C., the population is much more diverse and mixed between white, African-American, Latinos, and others. And so actually this claim that they're looking for a more diverse population location to hold the trial, that's D.C., not the more monolithic West Virginia.
Well, it's about the location of the trial, but also they have issues with the judge in particular, Tanya Chutkan. Do you think they have any real chance at getting a recusal here or someone else put on this case?
Well, you have to have a basis. You have to have an evidentiary basis. So what's the claim that the judge that's assigned to the case currently cannot be fair and impartial in deciding the matter? What is the basis for that? And apparently, she's denied this motion for an extension of time. But just because she's ruled on one matter against President Trump and his legal team, that's simply not enough to justify this claim that she cannot be impartial and independent in presiding over the trial.
See how easy it is when you talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about? Mm-hmm. This is so helpful, Jimmy. We can't thank you enough. Jimmy Gurulé, please come back and talk to us again. Law professor, Notre Dame, former assistant U.S. attorney in the Central District of California. Crisp answers.
Plain English.
Clarity.
Yes.
This is what people need. We're going to try to do this for you as long as these cases exist. With Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we've been discussing, we could have another indictment on our hands just about any time now. It's imminent, according to insiders, following the case in Georgia. This is Fulton County. A completely different prosecutor, similar story. It has to do with attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. But Donald Trump, by God, can't seem to wait for it, Kaylee. Is that just me? I mean, we have seen the polls and the fundraising go up after each indictment. I'd like to see a little reporting on that today.
I would as well.
This last one is done. But listen to him over the weekend in South Carolina.
Every time they file an indictment, we go way up in the polls. We need one more indictment to close out this election. One more indictment, and this election is closed out. Nobody has even a chance.
Can you imagine being Ron DeSantis listening to that?
Yeah. Must be tough. Especially when really tough. When people who have endorsed Ron DeSantis, like Congressman Thomas Massey, a Republican from Kentucky, literally said, quoted in a Miami Herald article last week, that they need to find some judge in Florida that'll indict DeSantis quick to close this indictment gap.
Wow.
Indictment
gap.
The indictment gap.
That's pretty good, too, actually. Then, it gets even worse when he wakes up and reads Nancy Cook's column.
Yeah.
This got picked up a lot in the last 24 hours here. The headline says it all. DeSantis camp hit by gloom as AIDS worry race is slipping away. Isn't it amazing how quickly we went from, oh, listen, it's so early, national polls, to he better hurry up because the window's closing talk.
Yeah, well, it was one thing when he was falling further and further behind Trump, who is still the front runner in the polling. Then you get all of the actual financial data and see, yes, he was raising a lot, but also burning a lot, that it was, partly political, sure, but also operational. That's right. Issues with this campaign. Very
much so. To the point where he ended up a special guest on his Super PAC's bus.
Yeah.
Nancy's with us right now. Deep inside the campaigns here, this is a great piece of reporting that if you didn't already see, I will point you to on the terminal. And it's great to have you, Nancy. What are they more worried about at the moment, polling or funding?
I think that they're honestly worried about both. They're very worried about funding. They're one of the largest donors to the Super PAC, Robert Bigelow, who gave the Super PAC $20 million, said on Friday that he wanted to see changes to the campaign and also more changes to DeSantis's position. So that's a huge blow to them. He feels like DeSantis needs to moderate some of his positions, particularly on abortion. And then I think they're also just really worried about the polling. There was a fascinating New York Times Siena College poll last week, which, Joe, you and I have talked about, which really showed that DeSantis is falling behind not just nationally, but in early primary states. And one of the most interesting data points from that poll talked about how a lot of his messages on culture wars just are not resonating with Republican primary voters. And that's really the crux of his campaign at this point.
Well, and as part of this reset, obviously he's trimmed down the size of the campaign staff, trying to work on the finances with that donor concern that you're mentioning, Nancy, but also in terms of that messaging, trying not to make it so Florida centric. He gave that big economic speech just last week. Are there any signs that reset in terms of messaging is taking hold yet? Have we seen any of the numbers budge?
We haven't seen the numbers budge, and I will tell you that I was with him in Iowa the days before he gave that economic speech, and he was still giving like 20 to 30 minutes, basically Florida stump speeches at all of these stops. He was under a lot of pressure to deliver that economic address from aides and donors who really wanted him to broaden that message. But then this week, too, we've seen him go back to the Florida-centered message. And I just think his staff in Tallahassee, between the layoffs, between the strategy, between the messaging, they're just feeling really down and out. There's a real sense of gloom there, and just a real sense, even at the highest levels of the campaign, that things are not going well.
Might explain his posture over the past 24 to 48 hours, Nancy. Every time a story like this hits, every time he's asked about having trouble keeping up with Trump, not being a great retail politician, he seems to lean in a little bit more. He said to NBC this morning that he said Donald Trump lost the election. And over the weekend, he was railing about promises unkept. He talked about the wall not being completed. He talked about Donald Trump's impact on the national debt. Listen.
And then he actually said he was going to eliminate the national debt. He added $8 trillion to the debt. We've paid down our debt in Florida. He did more in 4 years than any president has ever done to expand it. That's the record we should talk about. Don't worry about, how he does his hair, how this, all that. We got to stop with that.
Is this the DeSantis 3.0, Nancy?
He is definitely going after Trump more. I would say his team has been reluctant to totally go after Trump because their view is that what they really need to win this election is DeSantis uniting college-educated Republican voters, but also MAGA voters, also Trump supporters. And so they've never wanted to go after Trump too aggressively because they don't want to alienate those people. But it's such a tricky role for him because Trump remains just so dominant in the field. And these indictments, 3 of them now, have only solidified that position for him.
Well, and when we're talking about that interview that DeSantis gave, it's worth noting that as part of that with NBC, they also talked to Casey DeSantis. They were together on the bus. Casey DeSantis plays a very prominent role in this campaign. Is there any rethink about her role, about that strategy perhaps not working, or is that one of the few things working in his favor?
Well, she is not going anywhere. She, for many, many years, dating back to his congressional first race for Congress, has been basically his most important advisor and most important political advisor. She is heavily involved in personnel decisions. She is heavily involved in staffing decisions. And I think that a huge part of the reason that the campaign manager, Janera Peck, has kept her job is because Casey is close to her. The campaign thinks that Casey makes DeSantis more human, more relatable, more likable, softens him a bit, just outside of him talking about, a laundry list of conservative policy proposals. So she is absolutely not going anywhere. And I do think voters, when they meet her on the stump, do find her, charming and more personable than they find him. And, but the thing is, she's not running for president. He is. And I think that that's what voters are still pretty mixed on.
We've obviously got the debate later on this month, Nancy. That'll be a big point on the campaign trail, and I assume that he is going, as he's been shaming Donald Trump into going as well. What other events can he seize on? We spoke this was last hour, actually, about the Iowa State Fair coming up this week. Where are there opportunities for Ron DeSantis to show improvements in the campaign, to show that they're becoming more efficient?
Well, I think they're trying to show that they're more efficient by, having a much leaner campaign. But also, I think what they're trying to do is just be a lot more places and do a lot more things publicly. So you're seeing that with the Iowa State Fair. You're seeing that with a lot of travel. But you're also seeing that with them trying to do more media interviews, more gaggles with reporters. He had really shunned doing that. And what they found was that Trump sort of sucks up all the oxygen and gets a lot of stories written about him. And he's on TV all the time. And DeSantis sort of wasn't getting that exposure. So they're really trying to put him out more. I know the campaign is also extremely excited about this idea of him debating California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Yes, right.
They think that will be, a really strong contrast between a red state governor and a blue state governor.
It's a risky play.
Yeah, and maybe he'll get to debate Newsom, but he's not necessarily going to get to debate Trump, right? In a couple weeks here in Milwaukee.
It'd be kind of weird.
Yeah.
Is Trump showing up at that, Nancy?
Okay, I think that there's a 5% chance Trump shows up. But
so that's not zero.
Jeez.
It's not zero. His advisors have presented him with a range of things he could do outside of the debate. He has not made a decision yet.
Okay.
So you're saying there's a chance. Nancy, thank you. Great reporting as ever. Bloomberg senior national political correspondent Nancy Cook. Iowa State Fair starts Thursday. It goes on for the rest of the month. The 23rd is the debate?
Yes.
And then after that, we're going to be talking about criteria for the second debate.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be a very small number of people. They want to winnow this field a lot more quickly than last time around.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Important headlines on the terminal coming from Israel and following our exclusive interview with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The headline, Netanyahu seeks to change how judges are named, then stop revamp. Kaylee, this is a pretty important turn in the story. We talked about it a bit last week with regard to the judicial overhaul. Netanyahu now says he will not pursue the whole overhaul that was first planned by his government. He's only going after, as I mentioned, the makeup of judge selection, the judge selection committee, and basically given up on a lot of the rest of it.
Yeah, so in theory, this is a concession from Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah.
It's just the question now is that one that the opposition is going to find satisfactory if it still is altering the way that judges are selected? Mm-hmm. And the early indications, at least from our reporting here at Bloomberg, is that maybe the opposition isn't really fully satisfied by this.
Says there's no constitutional crisis in the conversation with Bloomberg.
I don't think we should move from one extreme where we have perhaps the most activist judicial court on the planet to getting to a point where the legislature, our Knesset, can just knock out any decision that the court makes. There has to be a balance. That's what we're trying to restore.
Restoring balance, he says. If you look at the number of people who have been in the streets and spent weeks protesting this, Kaylee, obviously not everyone agrees.
Yes. Now, Mr. Netanyahu says that this is about a difference between an independent court and an all-powerful one. And that in Israel, the courts, and this is a direct quote, have all the checks but have no balance. And what he's trying to achieve is more balance. And yet that is what these masses of protesters we have seen for months now in Israel really seem to fundamentally disagree with.
We're joined to talk about it by Galit Altstein, Bloomberg economy and government reporter based in Tel Aviv. Just to start off, Galit, what's the status of those protests?
Hi. So the status now is that they're still going on. I would say that they're down by a bit because Knesset, Israel's parliament, is currently on recess, so no legislation can really go through at this stage. But you can definitely say that they're still holding up. Every Saturday night there are very big protests. The main one is in Tel Aviv, but they do go on in about 130 to 150 more locations all over Israel. And this is a small country, so this is a large number of locations. And I would say that according to organizers, roughly somewhere between 300,000 to 350,000 participate on a regular basis at this time. Protesters, I mean.
Wow. So is it safe to say, Galit, that this concession isn't going to be seen as a satisfactory concession?
It will not. So we've actually we've seen the responses today. The Bloomberg interview had a very big impact in Israel. It was quoted in all major news outlets, in all the big newspapers today, with the headline everywhere focusing first on the fact that the Prime Minister did vow to change the judge selection process. Mm-hmm. And then the second part of the headline was that he was then going to stop the revamp. Okay, so that was the order of things, the way that they were reported in the Israeli media. Now, we've seen since last night here in Israel, when the interview was first published, we've seen the reactions. So opposition, politicians from the opposition were very, very upset with what Netanyahu was saying. And the protest movement has also vowed to intensify the protests after what he had said, after what Netanyahu had said to Bloomberg. Now, the main point, I think, to understand on this is that although the judicial overhaul that we are speaking about, which is very dramatic and very controversial here in Israel, basically had like 5 pillars when it was first announced on January 4th by Netanyahu's justice minister. And so far, they've just legislated this one thing out of the 5, which was basically the canceling the reasonableness doctrine. We won't go into that now, but that's what the government legislated so far. So then they have 4 other things that they have not legislated yet, right? But the changing of the judge selection process and the judge selection committee is seen here as a very dramatic step, and I would say the most dramatic step of this overhaul, because it would, in fact, allow politicians or grant politicians a much bigger power, or the power to basically decide who the judges will be at the Supreme Court. Okay. And in the Israeli system of government, this is a very big deal. It's very different from the U.S. government, for example.
Galit, I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia. This is another important headline that came from our interview, and I suspect it's resonating where you are in Israel. Netanyahu says, bet on Israel and Saudi Arabia deepening ties, the headline. Here's a brief portion of what he said.
I think that we are about to witness a pivot of history. Maybe. I can't guarantee that it'll happen. But first, there is an economic corridor of energy, transport, and communications that naturally goes through our geography, from the Arabian Peninsula, from Asia to the Arabian Peninsula to Europe. We're going to realize that. Yeah. And by the way, my sense is we're going to realize that despite whether we have formal peace or not.
Galit, I only have about a minute here. A pivot of history. How is that resonating in Tel Aviv?
Well, it's also making an impact. I think that some government officials that I've been speaking to over the past few weeks have said similar things to me. And basically what everyone is looking at, or when everyone is looking at, is around March of next year, of 2024, taking into consideration that the Biden administration will be very involved, it is very involved in these efforts to reach some sort of agreement between Saudi and Israel. And after March, assumption is that President Biden will be extremely busy with his presidential campaign. So people are saying that if anything happens, it should happen by then. And there is a lot of talk around that, but we still have to see whether they are able to reach an agreement.
Right.
Especially with all the security matters that the Saudis want to achieve with this agreement.
All right, Galit, thank you for bringing us up to date. Galit Altstein, Bloomberg economy and government reporter based in Tel Aviv. You can watch the full interview with Benjamin Netanyahu at the terminal and the website. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Donald Trump talking about different kind of showers over the weekend. He can't help but to do this, and we need to do it right. This was, I believe, South Carolina, where he got into the bit once again over the weekend. Here we go. I just want to get the... Here's the...
little things like your sink. You buy a sink and no water comes out because they have regulators on the water. Even if you're in a state where water comes out of heaven all day long, doesn't make any difference. When you take a shower, I like to have, I have this gorgeous head of hair.
Right.
When I take a shower, I want water to pour down on me. When you go into these new homes with showers, the water drips down slowly. You have suds, beautiful, nice, wonderful suds, a lot of money, Procter & Gamble, all that crap that they say is good. Probably cost them about 2 cents and they sell it for $10. But
all right.
You can't. It takes you 10 minutes to wash your hair.
I'm still not sure why he's bringing it up, although he did say that he fixed that when he was president. Did Joe Biden go around changing all the faucets? I'm still stuck on that. I don't know. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.